Jean Ziegler is coming to town. Who's he? And why should we care? Well, we'll tell you. Hillel Neuer is Executive Director of UN Watch, a human rights NGO. Does wonderful work. And the first time I think we've had such an interview, unless I'm getting really old. Welcome to you, sir.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I haven't interviewed you before, have I?
No, not yet. First time.
Because, it happens sometimes. I'll say, first time the person will say, no, you have interviewed me before, and that really is a bad start to any interview. Tell us who this Ziegler fella is, because he's coming to Canada, the Ottawa region, next week, I think.
That's right. He's invited by a network of food lobby groups that deal with human rights and food issues, as well as unions, some of the large Quebec unions. And Jean Ziegler is a human rights impostor. He is a wolf in sheep's clothing. He sits as an expert of the UN Human Rights Council for 8 years, from 2000 to 2008. He was the Human Rights Council's expert on the right to food. However, he happens to be a propagandist for some of the world's most tyrannical regimes. And indeed, in the year 1989, Jean Ziegler announced to the world the creation of the Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize. So that's who Jean Ziegler is. He's a friend of Fidel Castro, Chavez, and someone who has done a lot of propaganda to legitimize Gaddafi as he was murdering, raping, and torturing his own people. Right. He's an imposter, he's a fake, a phony, a fraud, and Jean Ziegler should not be someone that any union or human rights NGO would want to be associated with. So I and our organization finds this revolting and indeed despicable.
The phrase you used, wolf in sheep's clothing, because when you mention food and the right for clean water and food, this is innocuous. Nay, it's admirable. I mean, we should all be behind this. So this is used as a platform, as a pretext. But you mentioned unions. Frankly, I'm not at all surprised that union leadership in this country is increasingly radicalized. But mainstream organizations are inviting this man, and they have no idea. I mean, the idea of a Gaddafi Prize for human rights is... Well, it's funny, but it's beyond that. It's actually quite insulting, the human rights for a man who had no idea of even the concept of human rights. So how did he get away with it?
Well, it's an upside-down world at the United Nations. And indeed, the reason Jean Ziegler was appointed to be the United Nations expert on food is because the communist regime of Cuba lobbied on his behalf. And as well, he enjoys legitimacy in Europe as a radical left intellectual. And because he attacks America, he attacks the West, capitalism, he says all of these are responsible for the world's ills. He says if hungry people are killed, it's the responsibility and the fault of people in Canada and America who are exploiting the third world through their capitalist structures. And his books are bestsellers in Europe to far-left audiences, and wide audiences in Europe read his books. And at the UN, as I said, he was supported by some of the worst regimes. The Lockerbie bombing, where Libyan agents exploded a flight of 270 people who were killed in 1988. Well, a few months later, to legitimize his regime, Gaddafi created the Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize. And the winners of this prize, and as I mentioned, Jean Ziegler was the spokesman to the world. He was quoted in Time magazine, The Independent, in the Journal de Genève, boasting about a prize for the third world. And who has been given this prize since 1989? Well, Fidel Castro, the former dictator of Cuba, received the prize. Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. Louis Farrakhan of the anti-Semitic Nation of Islam group. In the year 2002, French Holocaust denier, convicted Holocaust denier, Roger Garaudy, won the Gaddafi Prize in the same year as Jean Ziegler himself won the Gaddafi Prize. Now, he's been denying it ever since we confronted him. But last year, Swiss TV did a television episode. They interviewed him, and they exposed him as a complete liar and a fraud who's been trying to cover up his deeds. And indeed, the Salzburg Music Festival this past summer had invited Ziegler to be giving their keynote address, something that was shameful, but he was their invitee. And when they realized what was going on and that there was a war last year with Libya, they wrote to Mr. Ziegler saying, "Dear Mr. Ziegler, you were our invited keynote speaker, but you know what? We've read UN Watch's reports on you and the Gaddafi Prize, and you're disinvited." And he argued, he fought, but he was disinvited. And so now the fact that leading unions in Quebec and the Caisse Desjardins and NGOs that should, as you mentioned, speak for hungry people, which is a noble cause, that they would associate with someone who gave a facade to dictators and murderers to do their dirty deeds, to kill, rape, and torture while he was at the UN propagandizing on their behalf is really despicable and is not something that serves their own purposes.
I mean, I'm still in shock, really, about the Gaddafi Prize for Human Rights. The Heinrich Himmler Award for Rabbinical Studies, perhaps. Can we just, last few minutes we have, the wider context of the UN, because the people behind this, most of them at least, it wasn't about one world government. It really was an attempt to reconstruct a world where people spoke rather than fought, and we tried to solve issues and confrontations in a peaceful and constructive manner. It's become really just a front, generally, for leftist, anti-American, anti-Israel zealots, hasn't it?
Well, the UN is a very large organization, and obviously what happens in the Security Council can be different than elsewhere. But certainly what you referred to characterizes much of what happens at the UN human rights apparatus, where Gaddafi was not only the chair in 2003, but was re-elected to the new and improved Human Rights Council in 2010. And we campaigned with 70 groups to remove Gaddafi. We were ignored by everyone. And some of the experts who've been appointed are just awful people. And as you said, it's an unholy alliance between anti-American, anti-Western, anti-Israel groups, as well as tyrannical regimes who like to find these odd intellectuals who will do propaganda on their behalf. And I just want to say one thing about these food groups. They may say, oh, well, you know, he may have done a few things here or there that aren't so kosher, so to speak. But actually, on their issues, he's been a scoundrel. Because the World Food Program in the year 2002, which is a group that actually does real help for hungry people, the head of it in 2002 wrote a letter to Kofi Annan. He said, "Dear Mr. Annan, Jean Ziegler is a scoundrel who is taking positions on food that harm the cause of hundreds of millions of hungry people, and he should be fired." This letter only came to light last year in WikiLeaks, and we published the letter on our website. So if these groups really care about the cause of hungry people, they should listen to the World Food Program, which said that Jean Ziegler is an impostor and a scoundrel. And as you said, it very much typifies the debased culture that the UN human rights system has become.
You know, it's interesting, some of these great men and women of the left, how frequently today they are exposed. Just the past 2 or 3 days, Robert Fisk, the very well-known British journalist who's written so aggressively and vociferously about the West, America and Israel, the allegations are that he has made stories up, that he sometimes has reported on areas and he hasn't left his hotel room. And there are a number of people coming forward who aren't particularly political, actually, who are saying, yes, we know this to be true. So these are interesting times, are they not? A great pleasure having you on the show, so we'd like to have you back. Will you come back?
With pleasure anytime.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.